Thank you so much for being here at this Pauhana time slot to celebrate this very important book. Da, 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 da. Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper. I want to, first of all, thank the Hawaii Book and Music Festival for organizing this. We are really delighted to be included here. I'm delighted to be the moderator, introducing Professor Vernadette Gonzalez, who is a professor, full professor, mind you, of American Studies at, and the director of the honors program at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. She's the author of 2 books. First of all, going in order, Securing Paradise, Tourism and Militarism in Hawaii and the Philippines, published in 2013. Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper, published in 2021. And also a co-authored volume, if you haven't had the chance, Detours, a Decolonial Guide to Hawaii, which she co-edited with Hōkūlani Aikau. All 3 of them are published through Duke University Press. And I just found out today that they're having a 50% off sale. So I'm actually going to put into the chat for everyone the link to Duke University Press with all 3 of those books already searched out. For $41, you can get all 3 books in paperback sent to you. So such a gift. If you're thinking about holiday shopping, what else could you possibly want to spend your money on? I had the privilege of having Professor Gonzalez my very first semester of graduate school, actually my first hour of graduate school, in a class called Writing for Publication at UH Mānoa, Department of American Studies. It was because of that class that I applied for my very first academic conference, the Association for Asian American Studies, which was here in Honolulu in, I won't say the year. I was absolutely terrified, but also thrilled to be under her wing, to have a mentor who really believed in me and wanted me to succeed. I remember her distinctly saying, the white boys have their network and we have one too. It was there at that conference that I met Narisa Balse, Faye Coronan, Kali Fajardo, and over the last decade, I have been introduced to dozens of Filipinx and Filipinx American scholars, historians, literary critics, and all of us getting published and transforming the field. It's safe to say, especially under Vernadette's tutelage, that you cannot subject our stories to the footnotes of history, or if you do, there will be consequences. I know I speak for all of her mentees on the call today when I say that we owe her a great debt as a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and a friend. I also just wanted to point out that for those of you who are new to Vernadette's work, she's been a leader among Filipinx scholars in Hawaii, theorizing our role as settlers vis-a-vis the ongoing occupation, and making connections with the Philippines, Hawaii, our twin annexations, and our ongoing struggles for sovereignty. And when the Association for American Studies conference was held here a couple of years ago, as co-chair of the planning committee, she made sure that Kia'i from Mauna Kea were featured on an opening plenary, and that funds from the conference swag bag featuring art by Kanaka Maoli artist Joy Inamoto would be sent to support the Puhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu. Detours, a Decolonial Guide to Hawaii, the volume that she co-edited, is now the first in a series, which she also co-edits. Our kin in Guahan, Okinawa, Puerto Rico, Singapore, other places too, Vernadette?
Palestine.
And Palestine. Thanks to her foresight. In short, Professor Gonzalez is the kind of scholar, activist, mentor that is shaking things up, making sure Filipinx, Hawaiians, and all of us who've been marginalized and made to play the bit parts of empire now get to occupy center stage. Please help me welcome Professor Vernadette Gonzalez.
Thank you, Kim. It's so much fun. I'm so excited about today. I think we're going to have a fun conversation, and I really want to make sure that we invite the folks who are able to join us to just slide their questions into the Q&A. This is going to be pretty informal, where Kim and I are just going to be going back and forth talking about the book, which just came out earlier this year. And we actually we were joking around about starting today's panel with a toast to Isabel Rosario Cooper. So actually, we won't joke about it. We will toast her. She's somebody who's about our age. I'm in my late 40s. Kim's around there too. And
proudly sliding into 51.
yes, exactly.
No shame in my game.
And Isabel Rosario Cooper, she passed away at that age. So this is, this is really a moment where we can kind of identify with this woman and the life that she lived. She's sort of our age, and we're, thinking about just sort of imagining her life and the many ways that she navigated the shoals of empire, right? So I'm excited to share her story with you today, and I guess then we'll just get started.
But first, we raise our glasses.
Oh, we raise our glasses.
Yes.
To Isabel.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you so much for what you taught us. Okay, so Vernadette, tell us a little bit about the journey of this book.
So it's funny that you started off with your graduate student story about meeting me, because I met Isabel Cooper as a grad student. That was when I read Ninachka Raska's novel, so another local author, right? State of War. And in that novel, it's a very passing kind of mention. She talks about this chanteuse, this Eurasian chanteuse, who sort of occupy this very noir kind of existence in Manila, occupied Manila right before World War II. And she was the mistress of the general, of our high-ranking officer. And the intimation was that she had been was no longer a professional in that regard, because she was now under the care of the general, and every now and then she would feel nostalgic for her life in performance and would go to the club and just sort of croon into the microphone. And I was very taken by this description of this gorgeous, mysterious singer, but I also very much thought of her as an archetype. I thought, oh, this is, of course, this type of person exists. She's an imagined kind of person. She is the result of different kinds of conflicting ideas about women, brown women, and different desires about brown women. So of course she would exist as a sort of stereotypical character in the book. And it wasn't until a little later in my grad school career, I was doing work on the first book, that I found out that there was such a woman who was the mistress of, known to be the mistress of General Douglas MacArthur. And so that was when my journey started. I started to sort of pick up when I could, and I had the energy to, because I was working on my first book, ways to kind of chase after this person's story. And it was a difficult kind of story to chase after, because the archive about her is not conveniently located in one central place where you can do a search, unlike MacArthur's. It's scattered far and wide. It's warped by conjecture and rumor. And so I had to kind of wade through that and figure that out. But it was sort of like a long, long journey, right? And so that was the journey to the book. And when I finally sort of wrapped the first book, I was able to turn my attention to her story with a bit more energy. And the journey of doing the research for the book was transformative for me, right? I have not really thought of myself as somebody who was a historian. I would probably distance myself still from any claims as such, but it felt a bit like a detective story. I was chasing after any kind of evidence I could find about her, because there was so little. And yet the same kind of narrative sort of always existed about her as that kind of woman, as the mistress of the general. It was very limiting. And so one of the things that, of course, you learn as a feminist scholar, as a scholar who is interested in the stories of women and the stories of how these stories come to be, right? Is that there's always something more. And there's always something, and that story of that woman, of that kind of woman, is doing a certain kind of work. And so I knew that there was always going to be more behind it. And I started to dig deeper and find out a bit more. And the more I found out, the more I got sort of just drawn into this woman's world to find out more about her. And she's not a sympathetic character. You know, she's not the heroic character at all that a lot of folks would want to write a biography about, right? We want to write stories about the winners. I mean, even those of us who know that adage, right, that history is written from the winner's perspective, and understand that, you know, there's a lot of sort of subaltern stories that never get told, still want to kind of celebrate the stories of triumphs, especially of people of color, of colonized folks. And this was not that person, right? She was not somebody who was heroic or sympathetic or necessarily somebody you wanted to point out as the kind of person you would want to be, you know? So I found it was a very sort of uncomfortable process, because I was like, why am I so obsessed by this woman, right? Why is this story so important to me? And so part of that process was also coming to terms with you know, why it was important, why it does remain important. And I think with what we've seen, especially in the past couple of years with anti-Asian violence, especially targeting Asian women, we understand why such stories are important, right? I want to actually share some images and some slides while we talk story, because I think it's important to know the person that we want to, you know, we're chatting about today. So I will do the trick that you told me to. So hopefully this is working and you're able to see the images. So I'm going to be talking about today. So this is Isabel Rosario Cooper, when she was going by her stage name Dimples in the early 1920s in Manila. She was a vaudeville star. So we can get started with that piece of her history, right? So the reason, by the way, that we know of this woman is because of her association with General Douglas MacArthur, and that is the reason she becomes visible and legible to us today, right? And so the purpose of the book is really to center her story and kind of wrest it a little bit apart from the story of the general, right? And to understand her as a person in her own right.
Is such the story of a working class woman of color, you know, in a man's world, who's got her beauty and her light skin. Sorry, we didn't offer barf bags for all for that part, but that's what she's doing. This is the world that she enters. This is the world that she has to figure out how to survive in. And then there's Hollywood. Hollywood. And there's Hollywood. Do you want to speak about that? Trying to survive.
Yeah, sure.
Heritage actress in Hollywood.
Yeah, so here's one of the first film roles that she got. So Isabel Cooper, after the breakup with MacArthur, you know, so I get that out of the way early in the book, because I'm like, okay, that's the story everybody wants to hear. Let me give it to you. Let's get it over with. Let's get on with the rest of her story. And, you know, a big chunk of her life is actually spent in Hollywood. You know, almost half of her life is spent there. And she goes there right as World War II breaks out. And in the interim between the split from MacArthur and when she leaves for Hollywood, she had married somebody. She had married another white guy who was a lawyer that she had met in DC. And we don't quite know the exact way that they met. There are rumors that they met while she was taking classes in DC. It's unclear what those classes were. Some people think it was art classes, and he was a lawyer, and they met somehow. But they got married, right? But by 1941, she wanted out. And World War II breaks out, and she decides to try again in Hollywood. She had tried quite early on in her career when she was still breaking into like the early film in the Philippines, but it had gone nowhere. And so she decides to go back to Hollywood and make it as an actor, you know? So this is very much driven by ambition and desire, and she really wants to act. You know, that had been her life prior to MacArthur, and she wanted to see what she could do to return to it. But the kinds of film roles that somebody like her could have were very limited. You know, it's interesting that you know, Empire sort of stalks her throughout her Hollywood career. right? Because the kinds of roles that are become available are available because there's a war raging in the former colonies, right? So, one of her first film roles is as a Filipino nurse. And So Proudly We Hail, which is a story about actually a bunch of American nurses, right, during World War II. And here she is as a Filipino nurse, sort of, with basically one or two lines in the whole thing, right? And it's one of the first film roles I see her in that I finally sort of, when I pop that DVD in and start watching this film, she's in like 11 seconds of the entire film, right? And really, it's really her story, right? She has basically in her entire life served in very gendered roles like nursing, like you know, like the geisha girl that she would also play, right? Later on, another film role that becomes available because war stories become de rigueur during that time. Like the harem, the Siam harem that, she's supposed to, yeah, that you see her, where she's right there. Um, Charlie Chan films, right? So these are the kinds of roles that become available to her in Hollywood, that still sort of a Hollywood that sort of still insists on seeing especially Asian women in only one particular way, right? So they're very flat types of character. She's never really able to have anything past that. So yeah, so it was both a really amazing pleasure to see her career unfold, but also a very dispiriting journey, right? To see how little of it there really was. And one of her, she has actually this very early headshot in the early 40s of her as this is a standard kind of thing that you would do if you were sort of ambiguous racially like she was, but definitely not white, was to dress up in the different kinds of costumes, right, that you could potentially get a role in. So she was a supposed hula girl in one of her headshots, and in real life she actually danced some kind of hula in the Los Angeles nightclubs, right? Because that was also the trend back then, was to have sort of exotic nightclubs, and she made a living dancing hula at a nightclub. And that is how she got this role in My Dream Is Yours as a backup hula dancer to Doris Day, because the choreographer saw her dancing in real life and then brought her and her other compatriots in to be backup dancers for Doris Day. And so that's the limitation, right, of the kinds of roles she's able to get, even though she keeps trying and grinding it out year after year. And in the very end, there is this moment in the 1950s, right, early 1950s, her last two films really of any note, where she's so excited. And this is where we see this letter, this photograph with a letter going back to Drew Pearson saying, I'm so excited about this film, but here's what's going on. So it's a World War II film, and she plays a Filipina servant to the main character. And she has substantial lines that, like, this is like a real role. And in the end, it boils down to maybe 11 lines of dialogue, right? And they're not of any substance. She just is basically the servant, the local color to Anne Dvorak's main character. And you kind of have this sense that that's it. That's the limitation. That's the absolute horizon of her career that she can have. And her very last role that we could dig up is actually this bizarrely autobiographical piece, right? It's a mockumentary about the art of burlesque, which in itself is actually like sort of a not quite soft porn, but it's pretty close, right? There's no actual sex in it, but it's a lot of women who are very scantily clad doing different kinds of routines. And in this one, she is doing some kind of harem dance, right? And that pretty much just sort of encapsulates the arc of her film career, but also in a sense her life, right? Because in the end, this is the performance that she becomes stuck with. And so, it's it's a pretty devastating story, because you know that, you know, a few years later she commits suicide. And we don't know why she commits suicide, even though again it's attributed to despair at not being loved back by MacArthur, even though again, two decades, many
not capitalism,
marriages later. Yeah. So.
Not capitalism, not white supremacy,
not the grind of racism in Hollywood, not all that stuff. But hey, he didn't love me back. So yeah, so the whole point of sort of unpacking all those roles, and the sort of the role she was asked to play again and again and again, right? Despite the kind of depth of her desire and her acting skill, you know, is just, I can imagine that being so depressing, right? And so in some ways that was also another story of like, this could be another reason, but we never look at that. We never attribute it to the sort of deep racism that gets manifested in this way in her life.